Hi there. I'm Scotty. I'm a practicing witch, a professional tarot nerd, and from time to time, I'm a storyteller. This is a part of a series that I typically do during spooky season, some campfire stories. Now, everything you're about to hear is absolutely true, even if it never happened. The summer after I graduated from high school was a strange, kind of liminal time. I was a graduate, yay, and then soon I'd be off to college, but it really was one of those in-between times for me. When I wasn't working on the farm, and chores they never end on the farm, or when I wasn't at my part-time job, I was spending time with my friends or just revisiting places that had special meaning for me. And I took the time for one more adventure back home before a new one began. I had this buddy who had a cousin. That's how this stuff goes, isn't it? I know a guy who knows a guy. Well, this buddy's cousin's granddaddy had told stories about strange lights in the sky and weird sounds on that land he grew up on. And I thought that sounded like just the thing for that one last adventure. So I drove out to my buddy's cousin's granddaddy's house to introduce myself and get permission to visit the place that he had told all those stories about. It's a thing one does out in the country, get permission to wander about. You don't want to be confused for some ne'er-do-well who's out there wandering around in the dark. Well, it seems that my buddy had passed word along that I was interested in those old stories, and old Mr. Gantry had been expecting me. He was quite a friendly old man, probably in his 70s around that time, and he had this friendly, weather-worn face and a shock of unruly white hair on top of his head. And he treated me to a glass of sweet tea as we sat on the front porch of his house. And after some pleasant small talk, he told me that I was welcome to go out to the field that I had been told about. He said, "Our barn used to be out there when I was a boy, but it's been gone a long time now. I was out there one day, must have been in the 20s, I guess. I was out there tending the livestock. We had us some cattle and pigs and chickens back then. I was out there taking care of them animals when I heard this sound off in the distance. I ain't never heard a sound like that before. It was like the buzzing of some hornets, but it was different. Now that sound was getting louder, and before long I could see off in the distance there was a shape up in the air, and when it got closer I could tell it was an airplane. I ain't never seen an airplane before then, not with my own eyes, but I'd heard about them. Well, this airplane was coming towards me, and it weren't long before it landed right there in my daddy's field. Scared some of the critters when it did too. The cattle ran off into the pasture, and the pigs were all agitated in their pen, as you might imagine they'd be. But them chickens, they didn't seem to notice. They just kept a-pecking on the ground after grubs is all. Once it stopped, the pilot, he turned off that engine, and he hopped out of the cockpit there, and he started walking over to me. This fella, he had one of those leather pilot caps and goggles over his eyes and this leather jacket. Oh my, he was the picture of a swashbuckling aeronaut, a Barnstormer. That's how he introduced himself, as Wiley Barnes, aeronaut, and asked me where my daddy was. It seemed he wanted to put on an air show for the folks that lived around there and maybe find himself some work dusting crops with his airplane. I told him Daddy was over in one of those fields over there, and this fella turned and headed that way. And he told me, he said I could look at that airplane, but not to climb on it. That airplane was the most interesting thing I'd ever laid my eyes on. It was a biplane, with the two wings, like you'd see in a World War I movie these days. The body of that plane was green, and the wings were yellow, and there were red swoops on there too, and it was big. I tell you what, I really wanted to climb on it. It took everything in me not to. Well, My daddy told the man that he could put on his air show over our fields, and in return, the fellow would dust a couple of them fields for us. Now, for a couple of days, this fellow flew his plane around making sure folks saw him, and to his word, he dusted the fields he promised. And while he was there, Daddy would let him stay in the barn, and Mother would have him to dinner in the house with us each evening. He told us about flying airplanes in France during the Great War, and let me tell you, those were some of the most exciting stories I'd ever heard. Well, the day of that air show finally arrived, and let me tell you, I was excited as any boy could be. Mr. Gantry took a long sip of his sweet tea as he remembered. A smile crept on his face as his memories transported him back in time. Daddy had me move all the critters I could away from the fields where the people would be watching the show so they'd all be out of the way. And I herded the cattle over to another pasture and moved them pigs down by the creek, and I shoot all those chickens into their coop. Now that airplane did things I didn't know were possible. Mr. Barnes would fly up real high, then come down real fast in a dive with that plane just a spinning. And just when you'd think he's gonna crash, he'd pull her up like she was a leaf on the breeze. And he'd roll that plane over, barrel rolls I reckon they're called. And he'd fly in these big loops, and he'd make that plane do other things I can't even describe. Now after that show, he landed in the field there and gave folks a chance to take a ride, for a fee, of course. And lots of folks took their turn. Daddy even gave me $1 so I could take a turn. And let me tell you, those few minutes in that air up there, I don't know if I've ever felt more free. Now it was getting on in the day when he gave that last airplane ride, and I guess he needed to be getting on to the next town. And I noticed then that a sadness began to cast a shadow over Mr. Gantry's earlier smile. Well, Mr. Barnes took that airplane down the field, and when he took off, he made this great big loop and headed back towards us. I suppose he wanted to excite the folks just this one more time. And he came down like he was going to fly low past all of us. And Mr. Gantry paused for a long time as he sipped at his sweet tea. We never did figure where that chicken came from. But that chicken got spooked when that plane came down and fluttered up, and I guess it startled Mr. Barnes somewhat. I don't know, but that plane, it didn't go up again. It crashed into our barn with a noise like I hadn't heard since. And when it caught on fire, that fire was so big. I suppose it was because the fuel tanks were full, but barn, plane, and all burned up so fast. Mr. Gantry sat there silently for a little while, then he stood up. "More sweet tea?" he asked. "Yes, sir." After a moment, he returned with refilled glasses and sat down again, rocking gently in his chair. Well, Daddy didn't rebuild the barn right there where that old one was. He always said that he never liked that barn there anyway. But I think he felt like that patch of ground was somehow different. Not cursed, really, but tainted. There's a stand of cedar trees there now where the old barn was. I remember helping Daddy plant them there. They're really pretty. "My Emily," he said as a warm smile cleared the clouds of sadness from his face. "My wife, my Emily, she liked to go picnic out there sometimes. She said that we needed to put joy back into sad places, else they'd always be sad. Now, it weren't long after that crash that we got it all cleared up, and we started to notice odd things sometimes. Like every now and again, you could hear the sound of that old airplane. And not just at night either, but at night. That's when you could see a light moving around in the air out there, like it was putting on an air show over that old field. Mr. Gantry finished his sweet tea. Son, you can head out there if you want and see what you can see. If you take that old track there, he waved an arm vaguely in the direction of a nearby field, and follow that fence line, you'll get to where you can see that stand of cedars there. And he reached out a weathered old hand for my glass. Thank you, sir, I said. And he smiled at me, turned, and took himself into the house, leaving me there on the porch. I sat there on old Mr. Gantry's porch, rocking gently, and I was thinking. I'd set out to explore another local legend, but was this just a story this old man had been telling his family for all these years? He certainly seemed genuinely moved at times, but if we tell the same old story long enough, do we start to believe it? Well, the late May sun was low in the sky, and I was already out this way after all, so I drove out that way Mr. Gantry had indicated, and it wasn't long till I reached the place he'd told me about. I parked there on the side of that old track where I had a clear view of the stand of cedars they'd planted where that old barn had stood. I grabbed my backpack from the seat next to me, got out, and hopped up to sit on the hood, leaning back on the windshield. The hood was warm from that drive, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The summer heat hadn't quite settled in yet, and a cool breeze was blowing across the fields. Reaching into that backpack, I pulled out myself a Mountain Dew. Those were our energy drinks back then. And got me an oatmeal cream pie, and I watched the sun settle in for the night. As daylight became dusk, I pulled out my old trusty flashlight and settled in to wait. I must have dozed off. When the sound woke me, it was completely dark, and I heard it off in the distance, a sound like the buzzing of hornets. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I looked around through the darkness, and after several minutes I could make out a small, dim light. At first it looked kind of like a star there in the sky among all the other stars. It was a little thing at first, kind of moving in a weird, zigzaggy kind of way, and every now and then it would make this little loop. Now this light was growing both in size and brightness, and by the sound, too, I could tell it was getting closer. It had a kind of greenish-blue color and moved gracefully against the backdrop of the sky. And as it drew closer, it began to dip towards the ground and speed up as it headed towards that stand of cedar trees. When it reached those trees, it was bright, about the size of a big truck, and it was speeding along about a foot off the ground. And when it reached the trees, it kind of exploded. It got really bright and really big and really loud and was gone in an instant, like a supernova in the night. My eyes were shocked by the sudden brightness, and as they adjusted again to the dark, I listened. The buzzing sound of that Barnstormer's engine was gone. After a few brief moments, I thought I heard something off in the field, coming from around those trees, and it sounded like footsteps. Now, I knew there were cattle in those fields, but this didn't have that slow, lumbering cadence of cattle. It sounded more like a person. Now, I shone my old trusty flashlight all around after all. It could have been anybody walking around in the dark in that field, but I didn't see a soul, even though I could hear those footsteps drawing closer. Now I hopped down from that hood, looking across the fence line, and that's when I saw it. A faint glowing outline. It wasn't something lit by my trusty old flashlight either. It had this greenish blue light all its own. As it got closer, it began to take on the shape of a person. And when it got up next to the fence, I could make out details and features. There was a leather helmet, and goggles over his eyes, and a leather jacket, and just like some swashbuckling aeronaut. It stopped at the fence there and just stood with a kind of expectant expression on its face, which wore as well this slight smile, a sort of roguish grin. Mr. Barnes, I'm sure that's who it was. Mr. Barnes, he didn't say a word. And then he threw out his arms and he gave me a grand bow, bending over at the waist. And that's when I realized what it was that he wanted. And I put my hands together for him and I clapped. "Bravo," I said in a voice that I'm sure was less brave than it was shaky. And he straightened up, flashed me that roguish grin, and simply faded from sight, leaving me standing there in a darkness lit only by the encouraging glow of my trusty flashlight. And I stood there by that fence for a bit as it all just kind of settled in. I don't know what I had expected to see that night. I wasn't sure that I'd see anything. And then I started to wonder. Had Wiley Barnes, Barnstormer, and swashbuckling aeronaut made his flight that night because I was there? Maybe not me exactly, but because he had an audience? I hear tell that those lights and sounds still continue to this day, and I imagine that it's old Wiley Barnes still seeking the applause and admiration of an audience. Thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. I hope you've enjoyed this story. If you did, please like, subscribe, share, comment. I'm Skaji.